never know if it could change your life. Take a chance, you're neither wrong or right. You never know if you don't roll them dice. You better roll them dice. You never know if it could change your life.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Dungeon Master of None. I'm one of your co-hosts, Rob, and it's just me today. I'm going to be doing a special podcast for you today, something that I've been wanting to do for a while, and that I'm going to do solo today for a number of reasons. I'm going to be talking to you about a video game. I'm going to talk to you about Pillars of Eternity, one of my favorite video games, and a great computer RPG, and one that I think can be really valuable to a dungeon master, and I think is just really interesting in and of itself. And I hope that sounds cool to you. I'm going to explain why I think it is cool in a second. And the reason why I'm doing this by myself is that for a variety of good and bad reasons, it takes Matt forever to get around to video games. And there are a lot that I want to talk about. And if I wait for him to actually play them, then it's going to be like 2030 before we talk about Disco Elysium. So I'm going to cover the few of these myself because I am a gamer, and I'm just going to call this segment, this solo episode, The Gamer Zone. And we'll just go from there. You may be wondering, or maybe not, I don't know, but why you should care about this particular video game. Maybe you have played it, maybe you haven't. I will tell you before I begin that if you haven't played it and you're interested in playing it, there will not be any major spoilers in this. And I'm going to talk about why I think that it is interesting and useful and what we can learn from it. And, if you're familiar with the background of Pillars of Eternity or the people involved with it, you'll understand why I think it's valuable, but I will explain that as well. But before I go any further, be sure, if you haven't already, to check out our Patreon at patreon.com/dungeonmasterofnone. If you like this kind of thing, you want more content, more podcasts, more stuff, it's pretty cool. $5 a month gets you all kinds of neat things, and we appreciate your support. Also, if you haven't already, check out our Discord, slap a like on this, all that good stuff. Okay. So, without further ado, Pillars of Eternity, or rather, video games in general. Let's talk about this for a second. Matt and I spend a lot of time talking about books and movies and TV shows, and that's because we like those things and we think they're interesting. And also, I guess like the conceit that we have is that they can help you plan, help you come up with ideas, help you generate inspiration for your own games. Now, you might be listening to this podcast and you're like, I'm just here for DM tips. I just want to know how to be a better dungeon master, which is the pitch of this show. So you might be wondering, like, why do I want to hear about a video game or a movie or a book or anything? That's all well and good, but what does that have to do with my DMing? And that is a valid point, and I do actually think that maybe there's something to just like a narrow focus on the craft of being a dungeon master. That being said, what we are doing here is telling stories, right? And so I think it is very valuable, whether or not you just run written modules or you're doing homebrew yourself, if you're an improviser or if you're a strict planner, to take a look at the structures of other media that tell stories, especially books, especially movies, but including video games. I think this is a very valuable exercise, a very useful thing to do. I get a lot out of it. I think it makes me a better DM, whether I am just running a module or if I am writing something myself. If you are interested in doing your own homebrew or doing any sort of game design, then obviously looking at other media is very, very valuable. But even if you just are trying to get your home game off the ground, I do think it is really useful to take a look critically and think about how stories are told in other mediums and other formats. This is, I don't know, one of the ideas behind a liberal arts education which Matt and I both have.
Benefits of a classical education.
I'm not sure that it has done a whole lot for us professionally, but I think it has made us very interesting and good at GMing. So that's kind of the idea behind this. So that is why I really want to talk about games some more, and I'm going to do a few more of these. And there's a short list of games that I think are very interesting and important and relevant to running TTRPGs and being a GM. But I also want to make the point that like games impact culture, and we've, at this point created some kind of weird feedback loop, Ouroboros, where games, especially RPGs, are influenced by the tabletop setting, and tabletop games are influenced in turn by video games, and so on and so forth. But it's really part of the same ecosystem, especially if you were talking about computer RPGs or RPGs in general, or games with any sort of like role-playing game elements or advancement, which is kind of all of them at this point. So especially when it comes to RPGs, I think there's a lot to be learned here and a lot to look at. I'm not going to argue that like Pillars of Eternity itself is massively influential, though I do think that it is popular, but just that it's part of the general media and design environment, and that it's interesting because of that. But it's also especially interesting because of who is involved and what their role is in just sort of the RPG game design and tabletop space. And I'm talking about a lot of people, and there are a lot of people involved with the creation of Pillars of Eternity, but its origins are in Black Isle Studios and in Obsidian Entertainment, which came out of Black Isle Studios. Black Isle Studios was involved with Icewind Dale, Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, and a bunch of other late 90s RPGs, and there are a lot of people who went on from that work to do something cool. But the two that I want to focus on, mostly because I know more about them than the others, are Chris Avellone and Josh Sawyer. Chris Avellone is an old school role-playing game writer and designer. He wrote for Dragon Magazine. He was involved with some mostly unsuccessful RPGs in the 90s, but most notably, he was a writer for Fallout 2 and was responsible for much of New Reno and a lot of the companions that were very popular and well written, and that kind of like boosted his profile. He went on to contribute to a bunch of other great RPGs, including Fallout New Vegas and Planescape Torment. He is one of the people who I think takes role-playing game writing very seriously. The other is, of course, Josh Sawyer. Josh Sawyer was also involved with Icewind Dale, Fallout New Vegas. More recently, obviously, he contributed to Pillars of Eternity and Pillars of Eternity 2, and to Pentiment, which is a really, really cool, kind of like a niche historical game. I really like it a lot. But these guys are serious about writing, about video game writing, and they are responsible for some of the games where, they treat both like plot and character and theme with some seriousness. There's a lot of really bad video game writing out there, and there's a lot of video games that are praised for their good writing that actually have very bad writing, and I don't know what people are talking about when they talk about the writing. The downside of this is that Pillars of Eternity and some of the other games these guys have worked on are very ready games. There's lots of big chunks of a text, and I don't mind this. I read very quickly, though I will have to admit that I skimmed a bunch of the text in Pillars of Eternity. So if you don't love reading text on the screen, these are not always the most engaging games, but it is cool to see when people have taken the writing portion of role-playing game development seriously. And so Chris Avellone and Josh Sawyer and some other people from Black Isle went on to start the game studio Obsidian. Obsidian helped create Fallout New Vegas and kicked around some other licensed games before they decided that they wanted to revisit the sort of classic isometric D&D style party combat role-playing computer game, right? In the style of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. And so for that, they decided that it would be better to kickstart a new game rather than try to find someone to fund their game. The result of this was Pillars of Eternity. They raised over $4 million. It was a huge success. They got all their stretch goals, and then they were able to actually make and develop the game. And I think this is one of the things that makes it so interesting, why it was able to be a little bit weird and a little bit different. I think it is also the source of some of the problems that the game has. But to me, I really feel like that independent crowdfunding made it possible for them to create a unique and interesting game that's a little bit weird. So all of that preamble out of the way, let's talk about what Pillars of Eternity is and why I think it's cool. So there are two what I consider to be really unique things about Pillars of Eternity in the context of computer role-playing games and role-playing games in general. And very, very broadly, it's the setting and the combat system. There are big parts of the game that are very familiar to players of Dungeons and Dragons, especially the classes and some aspects of the combat. But once you dig down deep, you start to see how very, very interesting and different it is. And I think this was very cleverly done. I think they wanted the game to be legible and familiar to players of Dungeons & Dragons, especially fans of Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, Neverwinter Nights. And I think they did a really good job of this, in my opinion. I personally am now at the point where I kind of wish they had just broken with that. But I think if they wanted to sell copies, it needed to be familiar enough to players of those games to appeal to them and not too weird. I think Josh Sawyer has said that he really wanted to get a lot weirder, especially with the second game, and was frustrated by his inability to do so, but it's still pretty weird. So let's talk about the setting a little bit, because there's some really interesting stuff here. So this takes place on the world of Eora, and Eora is on its surface a pretty familiar fantasy grab bag setting. It's got elves and dwarves and humans and dragons and all that good stuff. But there's a lot of areas where it departs from the standard formula, even though on the surface much of it is familiar. And at the core of it is one of those big departures. It's like sort of like the center of the whole game and the whole idea. And these are, well, literally the pillars of eternity. As soon as you start the game, as soon as you start playing, you see these big pillars, these big sort of transparent pillars sticking up everywhere, made of a substance called Audra, and these are literally conduits for souls. So the kind of general idea, the big deal of Eora is that souls, when they die, they don't go to an afterlife, they don't go to hell or to heaven, they don't directly become reborn. They go to the in-between, which is sort of like a limbo space, and then they travel through the Audra veins, the Audra pillars, to the earth and back out and are reborn into a body. So this is a setting where, for the most part, everybody is reincarnated, though that gets a little bit complicated later on. And this process called the wheel is the center of a lot of the plot of the first and second Pillars of Eternity games. And this has a lot of like really interesting knock-on effects, which I'll discuss later, but it's also like a great vehicle for storytelling and helps support the tone of the game, which is also something that I think is really interesting. It's pretty grim. It's a pretty grim game. Both the first and second game are full of horrific, violent murders, and some really nasty, gnarly stuff happens. Like these are not cushy games, but at the same time, these games are very funny. A lot of this is to do with, like I mentioned, the writing, but also to do with the voice acting. Matt Mercer contributes the voices to a couple of characters, and he's very funny. But also, I really like this combination of, kind of grimdark, but also, cheeky humor. I think that if done well, it is a great fit, and especially like gallows humor, of which there is a lot, works really well. I do think it is kind of hard to pull off. I am perpetually annoyed these days by a lot of what is now just sort of like default grim darkness. It used to be that was kind of the new thing, and now everything is kind of grim dark. And I think that if you're not very good at writing, or you're not really thinking about how to position that, then it just comes off as kind of like dire and depressing, which I don't think is really the intent or what is cool or good or interesting about grimdark as a thematic focal point. Anyway, that's getting off in the weeds, but the souls and the reincarnation of them and what happens to them before and after your life is key to the setting and a really important part of what's going to happen to your character and to everyone around you. And this ties into the broader religious context of the games, where there are multiple gods, your standard pantheon, but they all have very interesting portfolios that are a lot more nebulous. There is not a straight up like sun god or a god of life. They're a lot more fuzzier concepts, and none of them are very, very benevolent, save for one, Aothos, but we'll get into Aothos in a minute. And they all have different ideas of what should be done with souls, or what, where they would like to see them go. Barath, the god of judgment, a dual-natured god, is very strict and regimented about, sticking to the wheel and making sure that everything flows normally. Rimagond, this awful ice aurochs and lord of entropy, wants to see all souls eventually destroyed. Individual gods with their own portfolios want to see more births in the Deerwood, like Galawain, or so on, etc. and so forth. It's very, very interesting. It makes for, I think, a more nuanced religious context. Priests are critical, and people's relationship to their faith is very important. There's also a major departure in terms of species, races. Like I said, there are humans, there are elves, there are dwarves, but there are also Orlans, which are like furry shorties. There's also Amawa, who are sharkfish people who are very large. And then there's the big one, which is godlike. Godlike are creatures, species, sentient humanoids that take on the features of the various gods. And this can manifest as something like a moon godlike, where you glow and have, moon features about your head, or a death godlike, where you look horrifying and can kill people with a touch. It's a whole bunch of varieties of flavors of difference based on the god that your character or the character in question takes after. And these births are rare, and nobody knows exactly why they happen. It's very, very interesting and creates for a lot of dynamic conversations and interactions based around racial difference, but not in the ways that you would expect. There's not quite directly, a dwarf nation and an elf nation. So the kind of like tedious familiar racism isn't there, but there is a lot of prejudice against certain types of godlike, or against people from certain nations, regardless of their racial composition. This is a small differentiator, again, in a world that still has dwarves and elves and humans, but one that I appreciate. This is the kind of subtle but noticeable and interesting differences that I want to see, even if you're trying to make a game that's familiar to D&D players. And I don't mean this as like in a pejorative way. That's a lot of people's baseline for tabletop and computer role-playing games. So if you want to appeal to them and get them to play your game, then it behooves you to have familiar touchstones like wizards or like dwarves. But I like it when people take the opportunity to get a little bit weird with it, and races is somewhere where that happens. Another area where it's not like super weird or different, but I still appreciate, is that the technology level is a lot closer to Renaissance technology than it is to medieval technology, meaning mostly that there are lots of guns, arquebuses and pistols and blunderbusses and cannons and things. And I really like the balance of these, which I'll talk about later when I get to the combat section. But it there are still swords, there are still axes, you still wear armor around, but the baseline is somewhere closer to like the 1500s than it is to 1200 and the high chivalry knights and things. I think this works really well. We've discussed guns a lot on this podcast. I think that this level of technology is actually where D&D is centered. So I think that having guns is like an obvious choice, especially like early modern muzzle loading ones. The other cool thing, I guess, like technologically, is the practice of animancy. Now, those of you who are familiar with your Latin and Greek roots will probably guess that this is about the manipulation and working of souls. And that is a huge part of the world of Aora and the politics and economy and all this of the setting of Pillars of Eternity. The ancient, you got to have an ancient race of builders, right? The Angwithans that came before were master animancers. There has been a movement in some of the more advanced nations like Valia to rediscover a lot of animancy technology as well as brand new innovations. So there are things like animancy constructs, experiments with souls, attempts to graft souls or split souls or use souls for energy. I think it's really, really cool stuff. I think this is a great conceit, and it opens up all sorts of storytelling opportunities, which you see an awful lot of, in my opinion, in Pillars of Eternity, done in a really interesting way. There's a lot of moral quandaries and just sort of like philosophical, metaphysical ones that come up when you have people that can work with souls, that can put one soul in a different body, or can destroy a soul, or store a soul in a battery. Like these are really interesting questions. It is not by any stretch of the imagination the first fantasy property to deal with this, but I think it deals with it in a very, very interesting way. And there are lots of points in this game and its sequel where very difficult questions about your soul, other people's souls, and how to relate to them come up. And that, I think, is one of the things that I really like about this game, is the sort of like moral gray quality of it. Not, both sides are equally evil, but like this is a genuinely complicated question without an easy answer. And that's hard to do, in my opinion. It's, easy, I think, or easier to create a scenario where, there's no good choices, but it's a lot harder to create one where there's a lot of uncertain choices. And I think one of the things that's cool about animancy in this setting is that it allows for an exploration of that. As a consequence, or as a part of this focus on souls and the manipulation thereof and the magic nature of them, there's a cool conceit in the games, which is that the main character, you, are the Watcher. And the Watcher is a specific special type of soul that persists and has some memories, potentially all memories, of their previous reincarnations. This is cool for a number of reasons, primarily because it explains one of the pressing questions that I always have about both tabletop games, but especially computer role-playing games, is why are you special? Why should this game focus on you? And in this case, it is that you have a special soul. It doesn't matter like where your character came from. It still fits within the general storyline. I think this is a good tool to think about, not just like being a watcher, but like how do you explain like why your players are important? And a lot of better designed or better thought out RPGs have answers to this question. It also may be that they're not important, which is also a perfectly valid question. But in Pillars, it's also a great vehicle for storytelling because the player character has visions or can talk to people or can reach back into their soul, not, at will, but with some consistency to move the plot forward and to answer difficult questions. It also has it gives you some special powers, nothing that is major. I like the way that this is done. They're tools. They're not anything that's going to really break the game, but it distinguishes you from the rest of your compatriots. And on a more sort of, physical, material, temporal level, there's a lot of really cool stuff about imperialism and colonialism. Wouldn't you guess it? Of course, Rob loved this game. Of course. But it is really well done. The areas where both games are set, the first one is in the Deerwood and the second one is in the Deadfire Islands. Focus on the first one here, but the Deerwood is a colonized region that broke free, and their relationship to both their neighboring countries as well as to the metropole is really, really interesting, and to the native population. There's a native population of Glenfathans that live in the woods, and they revere these old Angwithan structures, and they have their own traditions and their own relationship to the gods. These are really I think these are really well done as a native population. They are, all of the cultures, I think, are their source material or the historical parallels are clear, but I think that they have been dressed up and adjusted and made interesting in some very cool ways, so that it's not just like this is fantasy Japan or whatever. So the residents of the Deerwood are just coming off of a major war with one of their neighbors. They are also dealing with trouble from their the native population, the Glenfathans, and always worried about the mother colony and all the various imperialist powers of the world. And into this, you, the PC, the watcher, are thrust and have to deal with a number of overlapping crises. I think that the game deals very intelligently with these. There are no like obvious good guys or bad guys. Who you side with is a complicated question. Everybody has their own motivations. There are plenty of good people, but most groups, most factions, most nations are self-interested or have some sort of material interest that you have to consider, and there are a lot of trade-offs. I think this is a great game for learning how to create challenging situations with lots of trade-offs to present to your players. I really enjoy putting moral quandaries in front of my players. I think that they enjoy chewing on those complicated questions, and Pillars of Eternity is written with this in mind. There are no easy answers. There are no easy questions. There are no obvious choices for the most part. And, especially they do a really good job of putting something very tangible and powerful in front of the player, a stat boost or an item or a major ally, but it comes at a pretty steep moral or ethical cost or some other kind of sacrifice. I think this is really well done. It can often, I find often in RPGs you're presented with a choice and it's not really a choice at all. There's no reason why I would do the bad thing or the difficult thing, but I think Pillars of Eternity does a really good job of this. Possibly the most interesting thing to me about the setting and the timeline and what you're dropped into is that right before, or pretty much right before the events of the first game, the region of Deerwood was involved in a war with its neighbor Raid Saris called the Saints' War, where Saint Widewin claimed to have seen a vision or been possessed by or been actually an avatar of Eothas, one of the more benevolent gods, a god that seems to care for humans. And Widewin / Eothas led this crusade and war against Deerwood and a bunch of other polities. It's not super important, but was eventually literally blown up by a giant bomb that was made by some priests of one of the other gods, Magrin, and blessed by her. And, now people don't know, is Eothas alive? Widewin is obviously dead. They lost the war. The whole thing is very, very interesting. One of your major companions is a worshiper of Eothas who fought for his country against his god and is always grappling with the question of, like, did he do the right thing? Was it really Eothas? What does it mean that this god embodied this saint and led a crusade? It's very, very interesting stuff. I think it's very compelling. I think it's very, a lot to dig into. It is a lot. It is kind of complicated. The lore is pretty dense. I think it's presented about as well as it possibly can be, but it's a lot. As you arrive in the Deerwood, as you're trying to figure out your soul situation, being a watcher, which, oh, by the way, will maybe kill you, you also discover that there's a bunch of children being born without souls, the Hollowborn. And the Hollowborn is sort of like the critical, the key crisis of the game. You are trying to solve it, but it turns out that it is related to a whole bunch of other issues. But this happened, many people believe, and it seems true because of Eothas being blown up and something's gone wrong with the wheel, so on and so forth. You also, the other thing that I think that you can really learn from this game that I think is really, really interesting and compelling is about companions, about NPCs. There are some of the coolest and most interesting companions I have ever had the good fortune to encounter in a computer role-playing game. Like I said, Matt Mercer voices Adair, the burly farmer guy who is grappling with his decision to fight against his god. There's Aloth, who has some sort of split soul situation. There's Sagani, a hunter from the north who is trying to find the reincarnated soul of one of her village elders to tell him about what has been happening there, because this is part of their rituals. There's Durance, who is a priest of Mogren, who was involved in the creation of the bomb that blew up Aothis, the Godhammer. He's a real fucking prick, one of the most unpleasant people I have ever had the misfortune of reading about, but that's actually kind of like fun. He's an obvious Chris Avalon guy. There's a bunch of just mumble jumble, constant griping, rambling, sounds philosophical, but is actually just a bunch of the horse shit. I love it. I think it's great. There's a Amawa chanter who was obsessed with finding a particular tablet, and generally a good time guy. And the thing about all of these companions is that they can at one point or another all kind of be real dicks, and there are moments where it is very difficult to keep them happy, or they cause genuine problems as you are trying to just sort of like adventure through the world. Not everybody enjoys this, but I found them to be very, very human and very well written, with very good motivations and complex desires. I think this game is a masterclass in good character writing. You can draw a lot of inspiration for how to make your NPCs complex and interesting. There are also a lot of side characters who I think are very interesting, who have similarly complex and nuanced emotions and needs and desires. The reason why I'm kind of hammering this is because I find many of the characters in RPGs of all kinds to be just shockingly, tediously one-dimensional, and everybody in Pillars of Eternity is very three-dimensional. I think that's very cool, and I really appreciate it. Again, it takes a lot of reading to get to that, but the voice acting is good, and it's interesting, and I think that there's really, it's a really good demonstration of how to write complex characters in like a fantasy setting, right? Like they've all got, it's not like they're trying to, open a bake shop or something. Like they're dealing with the complexities of living in this very weird, unusual world. And that can be, I think, hard to do without kind of seeming silly, but it's very, very well done in Pillars of Eternity. All right. I've been rambling for a while, so I want to talk a little bit about the system, because I think it does some things that's very clever. Josh Sawyer, I think, has written some like tabletop rules for this. I don't know if he's made them publicly available, but I think it is something that he wants to do eventually. But it's something that's going to be pretty familiar broadly to players of D&D, but departs in some really interesting ways, I think. And I think that it also like supports the setting and the story it wants to tell in a really interesting way. There is no denying that Pillars of Eternity is an extremely combat-heavy game. Even though there's a bunch of really good writing and a lot of attention paid to characterization and nuance and whatever, there is just a lot of fighting that happens. There's a lot of stuff to kill. And I usually play on the hardest setting because I have brain worms. I don't know. I like that stuff. Even on the easier settings, there's a lot of fights. You can get better about knowing like which ones you can avoid and how to be a little bit smarter about those engagements. One of the interesting things that the setting does, or the system does, is that you don't get XP for every combat. You get some to fill out your bestiary every time you fight like a certain enemy, but not an infinite amount. So you're not actually encouraged to go fight every single thing on the map, which is something that is encouraged in a lot of, or sort of like implicitly encouraged in a lot of other games, so that you can get XP faster and get more powerful. You get more XP from completing quests and from solving difficult situations than you do from just going around and wantonly murdering things. Now, the way that this pans out is mixed. There's still plenty of incentive to go out and wantonly murder things. It is a CRPG after all. But I do think their attempt here to sort of balance the drive for just violence with, a more nuanced approach is good. It means that you don't feel like you're missing out if you take a sneakier approach. Like there's, if you're trying to do one of the quests and there's a bunch of different approaches to it, which is often the case. If you decide to talk your way through it or you decide to sneak, you don't feel like you're missing out on XP because you're not. More specifically, I think that the attributes are really cool. There's not, I think, any like major groundbreaking things here. I think I really like the everything just sort of like fits together nicely to me, or it feels like I really like it. It all kind of like makes sense. So instead of having your standard strength, dex, constitution, wisdom, charisma, blah, 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 you have some of those things, but not all of them. So instead of strength, you have might. And I think this is kind of like neat and clever. Might represents your general physical and spiritual strength, your just overall just power. So it is important for both like a wizard that wants to nuke things and a barbarian. And this creates some sort of like weird situations where, you got a muscle wizard, but it affects healing and damage and your fortitude. And I think that's neat. There is constitution and dexterity, which do kind of like what you would expect them to do. Perception is a key attribute, and it does what you would expect, impacts your accuracy, but it also impacts your ability to interrupt, which is an important addition, a difference. You have an interrupt score, and you can interrupt people's actions. This is based on your perception and a number of other things. There's intelligence, but intelligence doesn't affect the same things that you might necessarily think. It impacts area of effect and duration, which I think is really important and interesting, especially for spellcasters, but really for everybody who has abilities, which is almost all of the classes. And then finally, you have resolve, and I really like how they've done resolve. Resolve is a little bit like charisma. It's your presence, it's your drive, it's your determination. But it impacts your concentration, which counters interrupts, but also the effect of hostile or the duration of hostile effects on you and some of your other defenses. So it's a defensive attribute, which I think is really cool. It is often dumped, but I really like that it's a lot more interesting and useful and compelling to build a character around than charisma, in my opinion, for the most part. So I think this is really interesting and well done. Each of these things has some other impacts and relationships to the classes, but I really like this 6 attribute distribution. I think it's really interesting. There are no real dump stats. This is by design. Josh Sawyer and some of the other designers have explicitly said we did not want there to be any dump stats. And I think they've mostly succeeded on this. So that's really, really cool. I also really like the way that attacks work, just very generally. Attack resolution is you're rolling a D100 basically, and you've basically got like a 1 in 4 chance of, in ascending order, missing, grazing, hitting, or critically hitting. And I really like the way that these are divided up. A miss is obviously what you would think it is. A graze does half damage or half as much duration. Hit is standard damage and duration, and critical hit is 50% additional damage or duration. I think this is really nice. I think this is really elegant. Obviously, things can add to your roll or subtract from it, your defenses, attacks. I think the balance is really, really good on this. It also means that most of the time you'll be doing something. Misses are rare, so you'll get a graze or you'll get a hit, but it will be reduced, or you'll, one thing or another. I think this just like makes a much more satisfying combat system. There are exceptions. Sometimes it can feel like you're hitting like a wet noodle, especially on the higher difficulties. But I think this is just like a bit more elegant and interesting than a flat, D20 hit miss roll. And with a lot of opportunity to add cool tweaks and things, there's also 4 main defenses that you're targeting. So deflection, fortitude, reflexes, and will. So mostly spells, but some abilities will target things that are not just deflection, which is based on just your physical armor and defensiveness. And yeah, you can see how this works really well, both if you're trying to cast a spell that creates a condition, or if you're just trying to shoot a gun at somebody. I think that this is just easy to understand once you get the core of it, even though it is a little unfamiliar. And I think it's a really like elegant system. Parts of it are admittedly kind of opaque, but I like the idea of it, even if sometimes the implementation is not always as clear as it should be. I also really like the way that status effects are done in Pillars of Eternity. I especially like it in Pillars of Eternity 2, which I might have to do a whole separate episode on, but there's degrees of intensity, and there's a relationship between the lesser intense form of a condition all the way up to the most. So, you have going from charmed all the to confused to dominated, and you can counter conditions with a opposite and equal beneficial effect. I think this creates some really interesting tactical decisions and makes both buffing and debuffing a lot more interesting and dynamic in Pillars of Eternity than it is in a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. There's also, like I said, there's the classes as well as the races are going to be mostly familiar. You've got a fighter and a monk and a wizard and a rogue and a barbarian, but there is also a cipher, and a cipher is kind of like a Psyblade or one of the other psionic classes from 3rd edition or 3.5, and it generates focus by doing damage, and which it can then use to fuel its psionic cipher soul attacking abilities. It's a really neat class. It's a lot of fun. It's a good balance of having to attack and cast spells. This kind of Spellblade thing is difficult to balance and get right, but I really like the way that they have done it in Pillars of Eternity. I think it's a great model for something like how a soul knife or a Psi warrior ought to play. So with all of that, rambling, me talking about it, the reason why I think this is so interesting and so compelling, and why I think you should be interested in it, and why I think it's worth reflecting on, is because Sawyer and Avalon and a lot of the people involved with this are game designers, not just from like a CRPG standpoint, but from a TTRPG standpoint. And they think very intensely about systems and about design and about telling good stories. And, obviously, this is the kind of thing that I like. This is not the kind of thing that everybody likes. Pillars of Eternity is not the top selling CRPG in the world, but I think that they have a really, really good approach. They think very critically about systems, how they work together, thinking about storytelling. And so I really would encourage you, if you are interested in this kind of thing and you haven't played it already, to pick it up. Another good reason to pick up Pillar of Eternity right now is there's a sort of unrelated, it's not really a sequel, but a game set in Aora called Avowed, coming out in February, I think. Josh Sawyer and Avalon are not involved with it, but I think it looks pretty neat, and I hope that it does well. I really like the world of Aora. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening there. Like I mentioned, I love the kind of stories and the dynamics and the dilemmas that are created by this soul environment. So I think there's something really cool going on here. So if you're looking for inspiration, if you're looking for ideas, if you're looking for a cool game to play, I think that this is one that is definitely worth looking into. Wait for it to go on sale, though it's probably already pretty cheap as is. It holds up pretty well. It's, not the newest game, but if you like the isometric type games, if you liked Fallout, if you liked Baldur's Gate, you'll probably enjoy it. And I think there's something really, really interesting happening here RPG-wise that you can learn from, and a lot of cool stuff to mine for ideas for your own games, things to model your own GMing off of, and just a general cool, good role-playing game vibe. So thank you for listening to The Gamer Zone with Rob, and I hope that you all are having a lovely week, and Matt and I will be back with some reviews and other cool stuff very soon. As always, thanks for listening, everybody, and keep rolling them dice.